I'm calling this from dome to dome, in part because we just came through a summer where we had a heat dome, and I know you're all familiar with the Tacoma Dome, and it's kind of the idea of, you know, shelter or shade in a warming world. What are the kinds of implications for these places that we call home as they undergo rapid transformation in terms of at least the climate systems that we've been designing our cities around, and specifically wanting to focus on trees as a question of shade, as a question of shade equity, when we're thinking about such heat dome events and the potential that they can have in terms of our health and well-being. I'm going to just, if you have questions that come up, any clarifications, feel free to put it in the Q&A here, as well as in the chat. Both are available. I'll be happy to kind of respond to that and kind of making sure I stick with the time limit that I've been given here. So again, really grateful to be jumping into this. I'm going to kind of cover a fair bit of territory here, and glad to continue the conversation offline as well. I want to just start with this idea of looking at our looking at the places where you all sit today and where you are inhabiting these spaces that turns out they weren't just by coincidence. There was a tremendous amount of effort that went into developing the codes, the regulations, the specific policies, as well as the land use regulations that determine what the individual spaces we inhabit look like, feel like, and essentially how those spaces then are conferred upon future generations. And this has been something that indigenous communities have been stewarding the land for time immemorial and have been keeping those future generations in mind. And so as we think about what our landscapes look like and the legacies that have been kind of in many ways locked in to our arrival, we're trying to understand how the distribution of different factors on the landscape affect our health and well-being. And so that's really at the core of what I'm trying to do. I'm really interested in the mediation, in how the built environment mediates our health and well-being through the physical, through the inscription process that our codes, regulations, and value systems kind of confer upon these landscapes. So in this image, you'll see like one road exposed, single family residential homes, if you get that land use language, and then just adjacent to that, a street covered by trees that we really can't even see the street for majority of this image. And those are just two streets right next to each other in the same neighborhood, just one block apart. Very different experiences of walking on one sidewalk versus walking on another sidewalk on a hot day. If you were to compare that to another neighborhood less than a mile away, there's a set of designs and a set of kind of inscription processes that have emerged onto these landscapes, where some roads aren't paved, where we have very limited tree canopy anywhere in this scene. This is something that we're really kind of observing the difference between one neighborhood and another. And again, those aren't by coincidence. Those are things that we have been designing, developing, and inscribing into the built environment through our policies and regulations. And so that's where the question of trees, the question of green space, the question of accessibility really come into play. And those are themes that I'm going to try to really flesh out in a few examples that I want to offer to you today to think about. So these historic legacies are kind of coming upon us as we're seeing a fundamental shift in our climate system, the built environment that we walk on, that we live in, that we essentially experience on a day-to-day basis, whether in Tacoma or the city of Portland, where I'm currently presenting from. These are kind of all mediated by a set of expectations of what our climate system has done in the past. And what we're seeing, and what the heat dome last year represented, was not only a breaking of climate models that we thought would be over 30 years of development, that we thought would be relatively helpful in predicting these events. It broke the climate models and broke the records that we saw. And what we're observing on a planetary basis is records falling one by one almost on a monthly or even weekly basis. And so we're entering into this era of the Anthropocene, where humans have such a fundamental effect on the planet itself, and the geologic epoch of the Anthropocene is something that we're starting to see take shape. And these anomalous events like the heat dome are occurring on a more frequent basis. So the question of how our landscapes, how our arborscapes are helping to mediate some of these incredible amounts of rainfall and incredible amounts of heat is something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. And I want to engage you, hopefully, in a conversation that helps us kind of advance a conversation about where green spaces and trees have a role to play in this climate age that we are now deeper and deeper getting into. We approach this field through an area or a topic or an approach called community-based participatory climate science. That's our approach to it. There's many different angles to this. What we do is essentially work with community-based organizations, municipalities, others, to be able to go out and engage individuals in these kind of smart sensor approach, where we mount these sensors on cars, on bikes, mopeds, buses sometimes, and go out and collect tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of measurements of temperature and humidity. We've recently started going into the air quality space with these mobile campaigns as well. And so this has been a means for us to kind of go from this broad scale description of climate and climate age to much more community engaged and high resolution descriptions that are captured by community members themselves and are interpreted and understood by community members. And we use temperature as a means for doing this because, in part, it's a very accessible metric. We've been measuring our own body temperatures, likely when we were kids, seeing if we had fevers. And so checking the temperature, air temperature of neighborhoods around a city is something that is often very intuitive and very accessible for community members who may not have had a deep scientific training or even participated in conversations around climate change. So we've been doing this for about a decade now, and in the recent years, it's been gaining a lot of popularity and attention. We've now done this in over 50 cities across the country. We're doing this now in a couple of weeks in Sierra Leone, in Africa, West Africa, in the city of Freetown. We're also doing this in Indonesia, city called Bandung, and then moving to Rio in Brazil later in December as well. So this is something that really I want to come back to, and really started in part with Tacoma, with the help of folks in Tacoma. And so I'll come back to that in a minute, though. My main thing I want to say about this is that this is a direct access kind of approach into a very complex topic of climate science, which allows us to be very grounded in a place and understanding what are the ways that place is being designed. The findings from this, a study that we did in Portland, for example, where we did the campaign in the morning, afternoon, and evening, starts to show how air temperatures and inequities start to coalesce. And we looked at this. This is a city of Portland, and you'll see a few of these maps coming up here in a variety of different formats. But the red is kind of the hotter temperatures, and the blue is the cooler temperatures here in the morning. Similarly, in the afternoon, that red kind of shifts, the blue shifts, and we see a very dynamic process playing out in terms of air temperatures. So what you might experience in the east part of Portland in the morning is very different than east part of Portland, for example, in the evening. So those are processes that we've been trying to get at very granular, very high resolution descriptions, which then we kind of look at in terms of the social or the human experience of these temperatures as well. And in this bottom graphic that you see, when we overlay some of these hotter temperatures, for example, with different demographics of different places in the city here, we start seeing that those places that were hotter were consistently where people had less formal education, had limited English proficiency, had higher levels of racial diversity, had higher levels of extreme poverty, and had less general access to cooling options, whether air conditioning or even heat cooling centers that the public health would administer. And so we're in a really big conversation right now about what does it mean to have these inequities, and why are these inequities showing up in multiple cities that we've been conducting these campaigns in. I'll just maybe on a side note offer that we've continued this work to look at the relationship between temperature and inequity, and in the last couple of years we found that this goes back even farther than we ever imagined. It goes back to a series of policies that were promulgated in the 1930s, namely called redlining, that would that shows that people who were communities of color, low-income communities, immigrant communities, were in these redlined areas of over 200 cities in the US. And those, even 80 plus years later, also see some of the greatest impacts from extreme heat, and are indeed in the hottest parts of town pretty consistently across the country. It was arguably the first study to have this, to show this impact. And subsequently, including a study that came out this year from the University of Washington, I saw was looking at air quality in these same neighborhoods, and they essentially replicated our study and showed very similar impacts on air quality in these redlined areas as well. So this is a policy conversation as much as it is a climate conversation. And if you look at this next slide, where we look at where people died as a result of the 2021 heat dome that came through the Pacific Northwest, these are official statistics, and we see that the distribution was largely in the Multnomah County in the upper left of the part of the slide, where we had almost 60 confirmed deaths from hyperthermia, which is overheating basically. And most of the people who died were over 65, and most of them lived in older housing. So this was our ability to kind of unpack who died and where they were in this event. And when we look at a little bit closer and see where were people living, they were often in areas that had very few, if any, green space. They had maybe some lawns in front, but largely canopy and shade limited. And so this was something I've gone to every one of these residences. We were able to get address data, and after the heat dome event, I literally went to every one of these to kind of gauge what was going on in these locations. I was able to take photos and really get a pretty good sense of what's going on in each of these locations. Here's an example of that event, and that relates to, again, an Oregon example, but I think with the data, we can very clearly show this happening in Tacoma, Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia, etc. And here's what I mean by that. When we did an analysis to try to understand where tree canopy was in relation to the deaths that occurred, and how much tree canopy changed in that time frame between 2014 and 2020. 2014, we had really good data from what are essentially conducted when we collect what are called LiDAR data, which is a plane that flies over. You've heard of radar, which is a radiometric measure of this. This is light measure, where we're able to get very high resolution descriptions of tree canopy. And we looked at that in 2014, and we looked at that in 2020, and found that the places where the greatest loss of canopy occurred was in these parts of East Portland and the South Portland. And so these were, apologize for the kind of blurriness of this, but these were between about 5 to about 6% of canopy loss between 2014 and 2020, right? And when you take that and you compare it to where the heat deaths occurred, it's a pretty compelling story that starts to emerge. We start to see that the communities that died in this heat dome event were also in those places where temperatures were some of the hottest in 2014, and then the trees were lost in between 2014 and 2020, where temperatures further accelerated, and likely leading to the inequitable distribution of heat deaths that occurred in the city. So this particular story has really gotten the attention of a lot of the policymakers, and we're starting to see a lot of movement, in part because we were able to assemble this very coherent set of linkages between the 2014 heat data that we had, the changes in canopy that had happened, the heat dome event that happened 6 years later, and then the deaths that emerged from those that heat-related event. So again, not causation, but a correlation that's really hard to ignore when we look at this directly. So I take this from the Portland example and move into Tacoma, where we've been engaged in some time. I took this right off of the Tacoma Tree Foundation website. It might look familiar to you, and this is a description of a very similar phenomenon. Oops, this is a, oh boy, this is a very similar phenomenon where we see the unfair forest in terms of where the distribution is and where it isn't, and the idea of expanding urban forests into areas that have historically not necessarily had it. And so this really gives me a lot of, this thrills me because it's one of those moments where we can actually see how the distributional canopy links to some of the assessments we've been doing in the Tacoma region. Similarly, this tree equity question has been coming up in a variety of different examples. The New York Times had a piece that I call the green squeeze, where we're essentially talking about the disproportionate access to green space, where they profiled a number of different cities around the country. And the city of Portland, where I'm living and where we were able to offer some data on that study, we were assessing how the landscapes have long been associated to real reduction in access or presence of tree canopy, and the relationship between rich or wealthier people and low-income communities, and the extent to which different communities have less and more access to green space. So it's really become a question in many ways of what have we done to perpetuate some of these harms, where some communities have a lot more shade, may run their air conditioning a lot less because they have that shade, may experience a lot less health-related impacts from these extreme events like the heat dome, and yet it's largely to no fault of their own that these differences emerge, and that these are based in a lot of policy measures that were done not only in the past, but continue to be perpetuated today. So I wanted to focus just a little bit on a project that we have been working with some of you all in Tacoma, called the Canopy Continuum, canopycontinuum.com here, where we've started to really profile 5 different cities, Tacoma being one of them, though along with Boise, Idaho, Portland, Oregon, Sacramento, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, the 5 cities. And we really were looking at temperature as well as air quality. And we were able to install a number of temperature sensors and conduct that heat campaign, as well as install a number of air quality sensors as well in each of these 5 cities. So this project is coming to a close now, and we're looking for funding to continue it. Though let me just give you a few of the highlights of this project. We were able to conduct this campaign similar to what we saw. This is actually in the Urban Waters Center in Tacoma, where we were able to kind of bring our sensors, set up shop, and really go out and engage communities in this field campaign, the results of which are essentially here on this website at the bottom of this page, though just took some screen captures to show you what it looks like in the morning. In this case, what we're seeing in terms of the absorbing of heat in different parts of the area, the afternoon at 3 p.m., what we were seeing as distribution, and then what we were seeing in the evening as kind of the temperature heats up and then starts to cool off, some places cooling off faster than others. And so what we end up with is this ability to then look at a very high resolution, what are the places that heat up the quickest, what are the places that cool down, and then where can we start focusing our efforts in terms of going from that science to much more of that policy and engagement realm. So here's some examples, also different ways of looking at the same data. This is some kind of imagery that we generated as a result of that campaign, where we looked, for example, on the left, that's just afternoon temperatures, you saw that. And then on the right side, we saw the cooling, the areas that have cooled down the fastest. This is the difference between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., which areas cool down the most. And there were some areas that went cool down. The darker blue areas in this case cool down the most, often related to green spaces. That's one of the things we found. Areas that cool down the most tend to have some of the more dense green spaces, and areas that don't tend to hold on to that heat throughout the night, and then heat up again the next day. So again, some imagery for you to think about. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, but to kind of move on, here's another image taken from the website, where we were able to look at not only spatially the distribution of heat, we were able to look at over each month across the year, where air quality was also registered in these different locations, these circles that you see in the middle image here. The circles represent essentially the places where we had air quality sensors set up with the help of folks locally. And then the heat data is kind of underlaid on that as well. And tree canopy from 2017 is also part of this image. So there's a lot going on here. What we're trying to do is capture everything from the temperature, the amount of tree canopy, as well as air quality in parts per million of particulate matter, which is what we were measuring here, particulate matter 2.5. And so what we're seeing is areas around the port, for example, we can see very high levels of particulate matter showing up. In this case, this is a July snapshot, July 28th snapshot. And what we're essentially doing is going through the week or through the year, each week of the year, and being able to summarize the air quality for that week of the year for that particular location. It was a way to bring a lot of information into a relatively easily, we hope, easily accessible infographic for different parts of the city. And so this is kind of, I think, one of the proudest accomplishments of the Canopy Continuum project, where we were able to not only engage community members, we were able to bring a lot of data into this. And we've tried, admittedly, some of you know this who are on this, we've tried to continue this through policy conversations, through engaging city council. I've given several presentations in different parts of Tacoma, or with different organizations at Tacoma, to kind of continue this. But at this point, we're kind of at a holding pattern about future work. And I'd love to work with Tacoma Tree Foundation, the city, others, to see if we can continue this work. One of the things we could continue this work through is turning this into decision support. The idea of going from these research exercises to actually decision support is something we've been doing successfully in places around the country. This is one example where we have a spatial decision support platform that allows us to go from this is the city of Portland, where we can develop these filters, if you will. On the left side, these filters that allow us to look at tree canopy cover, the heat index, air pollution, different socio-demographic factors, and then isolate a subset of places where canopy cover is low and where we can engage individual households for tree planting, in terms of tree planting. And we call this our growing shade tool, where we're essentially able to advance very surgically within the landscape specific planting locations that meet a set of criteria that we've predetermined through this particular decision support system. And so this allows us, again, to dig in deep. You can go to this particular website to find an example of Portland and a few other cities. We'd love to build something like this for Tacoma as well. We're building one for Gresham as well as Sacramento at this point. So it's Gresham, Oregon, as well as Sacramento, California. And we're kind of in this space of actually trying to do this for communities so that they can be a lot more, oh, I lost my slide. There we go. A lot more deliberate and kind of systematic and equitable in the approach to tree planting. Often we found the loudest voices get the trees. And so this is a way to really kind of ground this in some questions of environmental justice that have come up in this space. In another example, we've been developing these guidebooks for various communities, this one being Los Angeles. It's a behemoth of a place to work. You might imagine there's dozens of tree oriented nonprofits, as well as lots of effort to kind of green up a concrete jungle. So where we wanted to ground this work is within the question of urban forest equity. So we did a series of interviews, kind of focus groups, workshops with different community members, and came up with this simple little, for example, one of the outputs from this was a urban forest streets guidebook, where we were working with a Streets LA to identify tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 places within this massive urban environment to see where there would be very easy plantable adopt a tree kind of giveaways, where there'd be kind of backfill with tree wells and things like that, where you could get tier 1 spots greened relatively easily. They're available and easy to go. Tier 2 would be more moderate amount of work. You'd have to do a little bit of infrastructure, maybe some physical redesign of a space, though you can still get trees and green spaces into the ground. And then tier 3, which was much larger lift, where we were actually a transportation project maybe going into place, and we would involve the urban forestry community groups, as well as urban forest officer in the city, to identify ways that we can actually advance a much more ambitious greening campaign in different areas that are undergoing change. And then finally, a third example that I want to kind of close out with, as my time is quickly coming to a close here, is an example with Jackson, Mississippi, which is an area that has been really kind of under a lot of strain in terms of heat, and their temperatures are going up, and their green spaces are kind of very uncontrolled in many respects, with abandoned land. And so we're working with the city of Jackson, Jackson State, and then a nonprofit called 2C Mississippi, it's 2 Celsius Mississippi, to a climate organization, nonprofit, to engage community members around visioning what green spaces might look like in historically Black neighborhoods. And one of the things that's occurring is that there are a lot of places in this example of Fair Street that used to be a lot of Black businesses in this particular stretch of road, and it's slowly been kind of bled of its economic robustness. And now there's a couple of churches that operate on that street, though the green spaces have been largely decimated through the loss. And so what we're working is with the local community is trying to find ways to envision what a green, cool, healthy Jackson would look like, and engaging community members in their places to explore what options there are. And trees are one of several options on the table, though community gardens, community solar, and a variety of other applications. We're doing scenario workshops with the community groups in this work. So it's been really rewarding work to actually work in a place where I haven't ever worked before, and advising on projects that really have a lot of potential for changing the landscape and engaging communities in that process. So I want to just kind of end with a final project that I'm really excited about this summer, where we're actually working with a public housing purveyor in the city of Portland, where we're looking to install a series of temperature measurements in public housing in and around the Portland metro area. And the idea is to engage residents in this process, like we always have done, and go from outdoor sensing to indoor sensing. So there were several community members who died during the heat dome event that were in public housing. And so we really are trying to say, how do we engage community members, work with the local nonprofits and the municipal agencies to be able to develop a sensor system that would essentially warn not only the individual resident, but warn the property manager of multifamily residential developments where these deaths occurred, and at a certain threshold, even engage emergency management in terms of being able to make sure folks aren't in harm's way during a heat event that might occur again in the summer this year. So I'm very excited about this project. It's something we've really dialed in to pretty detailed level of project management and programming that's taking place. We have a social survey where we're engaging the residents in this process. They're completely part of it. They're very transparent. They're being remunerated in the process, as well as getting free Wi-Fi for 3 months. And so we're really trying to set this up in a way that's scalable to other communities. And it really I could say it really launched in part because of our work with Tacoma and other communities on the West Coast to be able to move into this space with the indoor temperature sensing project. Not so much tree related, but something I'm really excited about. And I just want to end with an announcement about a event that's happening in the Portland area that's coming up here to mark what I started with, the Heat Dome event. We're commemorating the 1-year anniversary of the Heat Dome with what we're calling Heat Week. And so this was an idea that came into my mind at 3 a.m. in the morning one day. And I said, why aren't we recognizing the fact that this was our first climate related deaths that occurred in the region? We need to be recognizing those who died, and hopefully they didn't die in vain. And we can actually use that as a preparedness opportunity to move forward in engaging municipal decision makers, nonprofit organizations, to actually involve what are the resources necessary for a region of the country that's woefully underprepared for these kinds of events that come through, and very preventable deaths that can actually be staved off. And so it's an event. I encourage you to check out this website, and just want to put a shameless plug in for this. We've got a really fantastic group of municipal agencies, nonprofits coming together. We have a bunch of electeds that are speaking at this event on June 26th. That's a Sunday. It's essentially right before, it's 1 year almost to the day of that Heat Dome event that came through. And so we're really trying to position this as an example of what we'd love to see in Tacoma and Seattle and Vancouver, Surrey, etc., as something we can really collaborate on to address heat concerns in the region. And trees play such a vital part of it, and we're seeing that really uptick in the greening and the focus of greening as a result of some of these efforts. So I'm gonna stop there, leave my contact information. I'm glad to reconnect with you all on this, and really grateful for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been involved with, and hopefully we can build on some of this in the coming months.